Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Trollhunters, Tales of Arcadia. Okay, so if you guys don't know, Tales of Arcadia is maybe one of my favorite franchises, well, ever. And the entire thing is that what if you're wondering what inspired me to just kind of finally figure out a series to review. Tales of Arcadia is made by DreamWorks. It is made by their specifically their animation division, because DreamWorks does both animation and live action. When most people think of DreamWorks, they usually think of the animated stuff. Because that was what DreamWorks was founded on. It was founded on the idea that their founder, Jeff Katzenberg, he did not like the then current CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner, and he decided to, and he eventually left and went to go found DreamWorks, and originally their entire thing was, we do think we are better at animation than Disney, and they eventually succeeded in giving Disney some competition, because they eventually made Shrek, and from then on, where they just kind of cemented themselves as a powerhouse, as an animation powerhouse, and currently are probably one of Disney's biggest competitions. Although the competition between them has kind of fizzled a bit, I will openly admit that it hasn't fizzled a lot. And they are no longer at each other's throats. Back in the day, very much so was the case, and now DreamWorks can kind of give Disney a run for their money in terms of animation and other things, which is cool. And it is good to see healthy competition like that. That's good. It strives people to be better than each other. But in case, back to this, what actually inspired me, because I actually watched Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio over the weekend. And essentially, Guillermo del Toro, his entire thing is that he has been very adamant about this, especially with the release of Pinocchio. But he's been very adamant about how animation is not a genre, it's not for kids, it is a medium for artistic expression, and he has openly admitted that, and he has been very open about that. And case in point, he made a trilogy of TV shows culminating in a movie finale. It is probably one of the best things I've ever watched. So all of that out of the way, what I'm going to be doing, and this is going to be a long-term thing, obviously, but I'm going to watch all three of the shows. And I'm going to go through each one leading up to eventually to the movie finale. So, in case the first one, Trollhunters, is about a kid named Jim, who finds a magic amulet and winds up becoming, well, the titular troll hunter, alongside his best friend and love interest, and that's kind of cool. This is the first series. This introduces our main protagonist of the franchise, and is essentially the first in the series. In case the episode then proceeds, in case getting into the actual topic of Trollhunters, the episode opens up and we find out from a radio from a passing car that it is 4:30 in the morning, and the camera then pans down into one of those drainage canals where that water is designed to run through in case there's a flood or something, one of those. In case the camera pans down into a drainage system, and we see it, and then the first thing we see is two trolls fighting each other. And one of the trolls, the good guy, Kanjigar, he is the current troll hunter. He is the guy who is currently trying to fight the forces of evil to protect the amulet that he's currently wearing. And currently on the opposite end, fighting him is Bular, an evil troll who's trying to take the amulet from him. And we don't find out the full context of this yet. But the two of them start fighting and start battling each other as it's starting to become morning and sunlight is starting to come up. And there's a bridge, so they're shielded from the sun for the time being. But but they're battling each other under the bridge. Under the bridge, and of course, a lot of their dialogue is around how at this point is based around how they're fighting each other, and obviously, as I said, they are on opposite ends of the fight. Bilar is trying to beat Kanjigar into submission to take his amulet, while Kanjigar is staying adamant and won't let that happen, and refuses to back down. And the two try to yield at one point, and eventually Kanjigar does succeed in pinning Bilar down with his sword, and demands that he yield. But it's this point where the sun comes up, and one thing we find out in the very early on in the series: trolls cannot be out in the sun. As we quickly find out when Kanjigar is out in the sun, he starts burning and his skin starts kind of bubbling and turning to stone where the sunlight hits him. And Bilar takes full advantage of this and kicks him underneath the bridge. Where Kanjigar then proceeds to drop his sword out from underneath the sunlight, and of course Kanjigar then tries to reach for a sword, but as we've established, he can't quite. Obviously, and this is a thing that across what I know about trolls, because trolls cannot move in the sunlight, but in this one, the sunlight. Well, we'll establish that in a minute, but. In case, Kanjigar eventually decides to brave it and grabs the sword, hurting himself in the process, and proceeds to battle against Bilar, and the battle eventually culminates in the two of them climbing up into the bridge, where Bilar eventually knocks the sword out of Kanjigar's hand and back down below, and to this point where Bilar gives Kanjigar an ultimatum, because now he's cornered him on the bridge, and there's nowhere else for him to go. And he proceeds to corner him, telling him that he can either die by him or die by the sun, but either way, the amulet is his. And it's at this point where Kanjigar then defiantly stands up to Bilar and tells him that that's not what's going to happen, and that that the amulet will choose another champion to continue the fight, even if he cannot, and that he will willingly make sure that Bilar will not be able to get his hands on the amulet, and it's at this point where Kanjigar then proceeds to flop over the side of the bridge, taking a defiant pose, as he completely turns to stone and shatters at the bottom of the drainage ditch. And Bilar can't go down and get him, because obviously Bilar's a troll as well. He can't go out into the sun to get it, and which means that the amulet is now just sitting in a rock pile with nobody able to actually go and retrieve it. And Bilar, realizing that he can't go out to get it, then is forced to make a hasty retreat, and think of a plan, and plans to come back and get it later when the sun goes down. And it's at this point where we actually meet Jim. And we meet Jim Lake Jr. And what we find, and Jim Lake Jr. we immediately learn a couple of things about him. He gets himself up at 6 a.m. We currently find out that he's into bikes, he's into mopeds, he's into those kinds of things. Because he falls asleep with a moped magazine on his face. And when he wakes up, he brushes aside, then realizes what time it is, and immediately sets to work. And what we find out is that he immediately goes, tidies up the house, cleans up he correctly makes breakfast, lunch, and dinner for himself and his mother, and he then proceeds to bring a tray after doing all of that. And what we find out is that this took Jim at least 2 hours. But he then proceeds to clean up. After doing that, he then proceeds to bring a tray of food up to his mom's room, and his mom is passed out, and we find out from a sign that she had been working a late shift and is currently sleeping in. And he then proceeds to bring it, and then we actually do meet Barbara, who we don't really get to know her, because as I said, she's asleep. But he goes into her room. And he proceeds to place a tray of breakfast next to her bed on her nightstand, and also noticing that she's still wearing her glasses, he then proceeds to take them off, fold them up, and place them on the nightstand next to her breakfast before scooping up his lunch and leaving. At which point he then proceeds to go into the garage. Noticing, and what we find out is that this is one day his dream to actually own an actual moped bike instead of the dinky little bike that he currently has. And he then proceeds to, but then proceeds to just get on his bike and gets ready to go to school, and discovers that raccoons have knocked over the trash, and he immediately has to clean it up. At which point we meet his best friend Toby, who kind of chides him a little bit, and Toby's a bit of a nerdier kid, but Toby scolds him, pointing out that they're going to be late for school, and of course, Jim is currently cleaning up trash, but he then proceeds to apologize to Toby, telling him that he got a little bit late, that the lunches took him a lot longer than he expected, and then proceeds to pull out 2 lunches, one for himself and one for Toby, and Toby then proceeds to take a deep whiff of the bag and to kind of try and guess the ingredients, and does know from the ingredients that he's smelling that Jim has seemingly outdone himself, and of course Jim takes a lot of pride in the fact that he's a good cook, but of course Toby then proceeds to tell him that he can't really accept it because he's on a diet, but Jim then proceeds to chide him, pointing out that he's been on a diet for 14 years and he's 15. So yeah, Toby is not on a diet at all, and then Toby does kind of snark right back that obviously obviously his body's still changing. He's still growing into his body and growing into his looks, and that's not true because he basically looks the same throughout the entire series. But I can dream. You can dream that you'll eventually grow into your looks and grow into your body. And to be fair, he's 15, so he hasn't really hit puberty-ish yet. So there's still time for him to grow into his body. But in case, since it took Jim 2 hours to make things, to make all the food that he prepped, he then has to he then has to go on an entire race where he has to where he and Toby have to race to school, and they have to take a shortcut to get there on time because obviously if they're late, that'll be a big strike on their record. They could get suspended or worse. It could very well be a big problem, and they need to hurry. So they decide to take a side road to get there on time, which Toby objects to, at which point Jim kind of jokingly mocks him for his lack of adventure, and of course, it's Toby just points out that he's kind of worried that riveting is what he's worried about. He's not worried about having a big riveting adventure. He just wants to get to school on time. In case it's at this point where they then proceed to arrive in the drainage canal where Bilar and Kanjigar fought. As Jim is waiting for Toby to keep up so that they can continue going to school together, Jim then proceeds to hear a voice call out to him, and specifically calls out his name, which of course causes Jim to become a little bit weirded out. And when Toby finally arrives in the drainage canal with him, he then proceeds to ask Toby if he heard it, and of course Toby has no idea what Jim is talking about. So Jim goes on to explain that he heard something speak his name, and of course it's at this point where Toby kind of gets a little bit confused, but then they hear the voice again, and this time Toby definitely hears it, and of course they then realize that it's coming from the rock pile, which they don't realize is Kanjigar's body at first. They don't learn that until later, but of course they then proceed to scoop. But then it's at this point where Jim then proceeds to scoop through the rock pile to try and figure out what's going on, while Toby kind of calls out around in the surrounding area to kind of figure out if somebody's playing a prank on them, since obviously it would make perfect sense for somebody to play a prank on them. He's very adamant about the fact that somebody must have hit a walkie-talkie in there, and demands to know who's doing it. But it's at this point where Jim does eventually pull out the amulet, and we find out it's this ancient amulet that they don't fully understand what's going on, but what it is. And of course, Jim tries to investigate further to try and listen to it and try and figure out if it'll call his name again. But then they hear the late bell for school, and they quickly realize that that's the final bell before they're late for school officially. So they decide to stop their investigation for the time being, and then proceed to get back on their bikes and proceed to pedal as like hell back to school. Meanwhile, an currently unnamed troll with 6 eyes, who we don't see very clearly at first, so I'm not picturing him right now, but but I do know who it is. But he then proceeds to appear from a drain, and he appears behind a drain, and is visibly surprised that the amulet has chosen a human. At which point, we then proceed to get a cut to Jim's history class, where we meet Mr. Strickler, who is actually his history teacher. And what we find out is that Strickler is very fond of giving Jim life advice, because as we find out, Jim is his favorite student. We very quickly find that out. But of course, he's currently going. But of course, Mr. Strickler is currently giving a lecture on the Battle of Athens. And all the various strategies that were used to try and take it, and we don't fully hear all of that because Jim and Toby aren't paying attention, so we don't really get to hear any of the dialogue that Mr. Strickler is kind of going on about, but of course all we find out, but of course they're also in the class where they're supposed to research things on their computers. And of course, Toby then notices that he's actually staring at Claire Nunez, who, as we find out, I should mention, is yet another major character in this franchise. She is Jim's love interest, but we don't find out much about her right now. But we don't find anything out about her in this episode. We find out very little about her, other than that she's Jim's love interest. And we do see, and Toby does notice that Jim is staring at her, and tells him to close his mouth because he's drooling. But Jim kind of shoots back that he's not. But in case it's this point where we find out that Toby has actually, using class resources, has been trying to figure out what exactly it is that the amulet that Jim picked up is. And he's not having much luck. And of course, Toby is still continuing to dig through things and trying to figure out what's going on, but it's not working. But so at this point, where Mr. Strickler then proceeds to approach Jim and Toby, and then proceeds to ask Jim if he's paying attention, and then proceeds to ask Jim if he's been paying attention to the very strategies that they discussed in class, and ask them which of the 3 strategies they discussed was the best one. And Jim, of course, wasn't paying attention, so he just responds to the winning one, which causes the rest of the class to laugh at him. And of course, it's at this point where class lets out, and Strickler then proceeds to let everybody out of class. But then he stops Jim, and is very visibly concerned for Jim, pointing out that he noticed that Jim wasn't really paying much attention in class, when he usually is very good at paying attention in class, and wonders what's been bothering him, and of course Jim points out the very obvious things about how he's been taking care of his mother. He's been concerned about a couple of other things, and about making sure everything's been okay, and of course. And of course, it's at this point where Strickler then does point out that he does sympathize with Jim, because he points out that it's just him and his mother. We don't find out what happened to his father yet, but we will, and it sucks. But in case he goes on to explain, he then proceeds to go on to explain how he understands that how Jim always takes care of his mother, but also points out that he shouldn't be that he should also be willing to strike balance in his life, and that he shouldn't overwork himself. And also before Jim officially leaves his class, he then proceeds to give him a bit of advice about how he would probably have more. He then proceeds to give him a bit of dating advice about how if he's seriously interested in Claire, that he would probably have better luck talking to than staring at. And Jim then proceeds to thank him for his advice, and then proceeds to go on to his gym class, where of course we quickly find out that Toby obviously is not physically fit. I've shown the character art of him, you can probably guess he's not very good at gym class. And case in point, you know those, I've never actually had one of these in any of the gym classes that I've taken, but you know those rope climb things where you gotta where you have to find a way to climb the rope and get to the top and ring the bell? Yeah, Toby is currently struggling with one of those, and I have never seen anybody do one of these, and I've never had a class that has done one of these, so I would not be able to. So I am convinced that it's just something that is made up for gym classes because I have never seen it. But in case, that is essentially what. If your gym class has done this, let me know in the comments. But I have never seen it but I've never done it myself. So I'm choosing to suspend my disbelief a little bit because I'm pretty convinced that that's something that films and other things have made up. Because I have never seen anybody actually do that. But in case, of course, Toby is struggling with that, and it's at this point where Coach Lawrence, the gym teacher, he walks over and is very visibly angry about the fact that Toby isn't able to do it, pointing out that everybody in his class should at least be physically capable of climbing the rope and ringing the bell. And obviously Toby is not physically capable of doing that, so he then proceeds to berate him for it, pointing out that he needs to do better and a bunch of other things. And we don't see most of this conversation. It just kind of happens in the background. But in any case, while Toby is dealing with Coach Lawrence, it's at this point where Jim sees Claire sitting in one of the bleachers because she already climbed the rope and rang the bell, so she gets to spend the rest of the class off. But he then proceeds to walk over to her and then starts speaking Spanish to her, having taken Strickler's advice. He just tried to speak to her, and Claire is impressed that he can speak Spanish. But as it turns out, he only really knows how to say hello and goodbye. So of course he has. So when he tries to follow up to her question, he's visibly confused as to where to proceed. And it's of course at this point where Claire's friends tell her that it's time for them to go and that they need to leave for class, and of course they then proceed to get up, but before they leave, Claire stops and asks Jim if he's into Shakespeare, and Jim isn't entirely sure how to respond to that, but so of course and is also confused as to why she's just asking him that out of the blue. So she then proceeds to pull out a pamphlet for their upcoming musical. And what we find out is that it's on a Shakespeare play. I forget specifically which. I think it's Romeo and Juliet. But she then proceeds to go on to state that they're trying to get people to actually go on to actually try and audition, and they're having trouble getting guys to do it. So she would very much appreciate it if he was able to come there. And while he doesn't fully answer her right away, he does admit that he's considering it. At which point we then cut back into the conversation with Coach Lawrence and Toby, and he's currently calling Toby a pinata full of candy, which is funny. But in case, it's at this point where they then proceed to go into the locker room to change and get ready to leave and go home. At which point we find out that it's not just gym-related things. Toby, throughout this upcoming conversation with Jim, is struggling to put on a sock. And that is all you need, all the visual you need. In case Toby and Jim are currently, while Jim is finished getting dressed and ready to go home, Toby is currently in the process of putting on a sock, as I mentioned, and it's at this point where Jim confesses that he actually did go and talk to Claire. And of course it's at this point where obviously Toby is very concerned, pointing out that obviously he's surprised that Jim actually went up and talked to her. And of course it's at this point where Jim points out that he actually just kind of busted out his Espanol on her. And Toby just kind of rolls his eyes at him, pointing out that's always the very weird thing for him to pull out. And but then also points out that he should go for it. He should try and apply. He should try and go and try out for the play. And Jim kind of is reluctant to do so because while he's been thinking about it, he also points out that he's not much of an actor, and he points out that he's not entirely sure if that's actually going to work out for him. And he also points out that he's also kind of looking into a life, wishing that there was more to that than just school, because as he points out, he doesn't really feel like there. He kind of just feels like that he's kind of just going through the motions, and he wishes there was more to school. And of course, Toby then proceeds to point out that's crazy talk, and that this is pretty much all it is. And that there isn't going to be any sort of grand adventure for them to go on or anything like that. It's just life. But to this point, we're out of the corner of his eye. Jim then proceeds to see something move around the shadows, and we don't fully understand what it is. But Jim then proceeds to follow whatever it is into the shower room, which is currently somebody had left the water on or something because it's full of steam. But he goes in and starts looking around, but and tries to figure out who exactly it is that's in there. But before he can, Toby then proceeds to successfully get his sock on, and they then proceed to leave and go. And Jim doesn't fully understand what's going on, so he leaves, unaware that what he was looking at was a troll that had somehow snuck into the bathroom. And it's unclear who the troll is at this time. So, and we don't even fully see him because, again, the steam kind of obscures his appearance a little bit. But he then proceeds to walk out of the bed. He then proceeds to walk. They then proceed to walk out of school and get ready to get on their bikes and go home. When they see this local bully, Steve Palchuk, shoving the local nerd, Eli Pepperjack, into a locker. And what we find, and of course, Toby then urges Jim to just move on and go and not focus on it, and that's but Jim points out that they can't just let Steve do that. But Toby argues that if Steve is shoving Eli into a locker, that means he's not shoving them into a locker, and that it's none of their business. But Jim, being the stand-up guy that he is, decides that he's not gonna let Steve pick on Eli, and then walks up to him and tells him to let him go, and let him out of the locker. But Steve of course tells Jim to mind his own business because obviously it doesn't concern him. And does point out that he was talking to Eli about something really funny he saw. And as well, because that's why he shoved him in a locker. And what we find out is that Eli has actually seen trolls before. As we find out, according to Eli, he has seen trolls, but doesn't fully comprehend what they are. But he does admit that he's seen, and the way he describes them as creatures with stone skin, which is a troll. But of course, Steve didn't believe him, hence why he shoved him in a locker. So. And of course, we know the trolls are real. We know the trolls are real because we see them fighting at the start of the episode. But of course, Jim points out that even if it is a little bit of a weird story, that he should just let him out, and that's it, and that he shouldn't just pick on somebody helpless. At which point Steve runs up to him and grabs him and is about to beat Jim senseless, and only very unexpectedly, Jim tells Steve to do it. And of course, Steve is very visibly confused, pointing out if he heard Jim correctly. And Jim then proceeds to hit very cut very deep with a scathing insult back. Telling Steve that when they're all older and they've all gone on their separate lives and they've all left high school and gone on to go get jobs, that Steve will lose all of his hair and will eventually become fat and overweight, while Eli will go on to become a tech billionaire. He will go on to go into software, and he will become very rich and wealthy. And Eli does kind of support Jim from the locker, telling him that he does like computers. But of course Steve slams the locker and tells him to shut up. At which point Toby raises a chant of "Let him out," which of course causes Steve to kind of consider just think about what his options are, because obviously everybody's turned against him. But it's at this point where Coach Lawrence then proceeds to barge out of the school, and then proceeds to ask Steve why he isn't at school yet, and why he isn't at practice yet. And Steve points out that he lies, of course, but he then proceeds to tell Coach Lawrence that he was just helping Eli out with something, and that he was currently letting him out of the locker, which of course is a lie, because obviously Steve shoved Eli into the locker to begin with. But But of course, he then proceeds to tell Steve that he needs to get to practice on the double, and Steve does that. He then proceeds to close the locker with Eli in it again. At which point he tells them that they're not finished, and that's he then tells them that Friday after school he implies that he's gonna beat the shit out of them, but he then tells them that they're going to meet Friday after school. And it's at this point where Steve then proceeds to leave to go to class, making a ticking noise like a clock. At which point Jim lets Eli out of the locker, and Eli thanks Jim for his bravery. At which point Toby and Jim proceed to go home, and Toby does comment on the fact that Jim was so very cool and very brave, but also points out that he's probably gonna die Friday because he picked with Steve Palchuk. So, and Steve is kind of a little bit psycho, but of course Jim points out that it was worth it, and that it was worth helping someone out. At which point they stop. At which point we see Jim's mom Barbara in a car, and she's on her way to work, and of course Jim asks her if Jim points out that if she has to go to work tonight, but of course Jim then proceeds to but of course Barbara points out that obviously she kind of has to, since as we find out, all the other doctors have been called out, and Jim And Jim, and of course, while Jim is talking about, while she's talking about that, we thought, well, this is something that we find out, but of course, Strickler had actually given Jim his number in their brief conversation, to kind of schedule a meeting with her, and Jim pulls out the thing for that, and does pull out the number for that, and but then decides against giving it to her and puts it back in the thing. At which point he puts it back in his backpack, and of course he then asks Barbara if she got the dinner he made her, and she confirms that he did, but then he proceeds to tell her that she should use an actual microwave. She shouldn't try to nuke it last time because it ruins the like she did last time, because it ruins the flavor. At which point she tells her that she won't, and she'll try to find somewhere proper to cook it. At which point she gets out of the. She then proceeds to drive off, and Toby then proceeds to tells Jim that he mothers his mother a lot. At which point they then proceed to go back to their respective houses, and they decide to kind of break for the day. At which point Jim then proceeds to go into his house, and he then proceeds to sit down and start watching TV. Also taking out some of his schoolwork and all the other things that he needs to do. And while he's doing that, he pulls out the amulet and is curious as to what it is. Still curious as to what it is and why it spoke his name. At which point he then proceeds to immediately get a call from Toby, who asks him if it did anything. And of course Jim over the phone tells him that it hasn't done anything yet, but he'll keep him posted. At which point Toby's Nana hollers to him, telling him to get off the phone because it's time to eat. And of course it's at this point where when Toby hangs up, telling him that he's got to go. At which point he hangs up. At which point Jim then proceeds to go about making dinner and possibly prepping more meals for the rest of the week as well. When he suddenly hears a noise coming from the basement, and of course it's at this point where the amulet starts glowing, but Jim of course doesn't fully understand what it is. He just hears the noise coming from the basement and immediately goes down to investigate. And of course he believing it's raccoons again, he then proceeds to grab a broom and is prepared to fight and chase them off. He then proceeds to go into the basement, not fully understanding what he's looking for. He doesn't understand yet what is actually in the basement. But as he's going around with his broom, he suddenly hears a noise, and then the lights actually shut off. And now more visibly distressed, he starts looking around, and it's at this point where the two trolls we saw properly introduce themselves. First and foremost is the troll with 6 eyes, who and when Jim sees both of them, obviously he freaks out because he doesn't know what a troll is, and obviously he's very visibly perturbed about the fact that he saw a troll. They seen trolls in his basement, and of course he immediately panics, and of course the two trolls immediately confuse his panic screaming for his panic screaming and constant hurting himself in his panic. as a form of greeting, because obviously the trolls, they don't understand troll culture. But and also this scene very much establishes that the two trolls who do introduce themselves when Jim first meet them. The one with the 6 eyes is named Blinky. Well, the really big one the one of few words is named Arg, with 3 R's, as Arg points out. But yeah, Blinky and Arg try to introduce themselves, and of course Jim is obviously panicking, and eventually, throughout Jim's panic state, they do start introducing themselves, and it's at this point where Blinky then proceeds to go on to explain why exactly it is that he and Arg are there, and throughout this entire conversation, he refers to Jim as Master Jim, and of course, Jim isn't fully understanding who this guy is, of course. But periodically, as Blinky is trying to explain things, Arg fully doesn't understand some of the words that Blinky is using, and he has to constantly correct himself, correct Arg, and that's kind of the odd couple dynamic where Arg is very dim-witted but kind of understands the words somewhat anyway, whereas Blinky has to constantly explain things to him. But of course, Blinky tells it. But of course, once they actually get Jim to calm down, which culminates in Arg picking Jim up at one point, with Jim obviously being panicked about that. And eventually, Jim does muster up enough courage to tell Arg to put him down, which he does, and then puts him down and gives him a little pat on the head, which is adorable. It's at this point where Blinky then proceeds to finally tell Jim why they're there. They are there to train him to be the next troll hunter, and they tell him that he's going to be taking on a big responsibility to protect trollkind. Tells them that he's going to go on to become a very brave warrior and protector. And it's at this point when Jim hears all of this, after experiencing all of this entire whiplash of things and all of this newfound information, he promptly passes out on the basement floor. And Jim and Blinky just kind of Blinky and Arg just kind of leave Jim there, and they leave. At which point it's at this point where Jim wakes up. It's the next morning, and he proceeds to call Toby and lets him know what's going on. And Toby, of course, is very visibly distracted by the fact that he's currently in his dentist going out to a dentist appointment to get his teeth cleaned and all those other things. And of course, when Jim is trying to explain to Toby what's going on, Toby, of course, is very distracted by that and eventually has to hang up because he can't really talk right now. At which point, Jim, realizing that he really has no other solution, he then proceeds to go and talk to Mr. Strickler, and then proceeds to meet with him in his office after school that day. And of course, he then proceeds to kind of try and explain to him, and of course, Strickler greets Jim, and just also starts fiddling with his pen as well while he's talking to Jim, and of course, Jim comes to him, pointing out that he doesn't fully understand what he saw himself, but he tells Strickler that he saw something last night. He wants to talk to somebody about it, and Strickler tells Strickler that even if he doesn't believe him, it is the truth, and that he wants to come clean about it. And of course, Strickler promises that he's not going to laugh. He's not going to judge him. He's going to believe him as straight as he can. At which point, Jim proceeds to pull up a stool and starts fiddling with it to raise the height, while also telling Strickler what he saw, or at least partially. He goes on to tell Strickler that he's raised it, that he was in his house when somebody showed up at his house, and when he gets to the part where he tries to tell him that he saw trolls, he then proceeds to kind of break it off and decides to tell him that he saw trainers and he makes up this lie mainly on the spot because Strickler has a chess set in his office, but he then lies and tells him that there was personal trainers come to teach him the art of chess, and of course when Strickler points out that asks him why he that would perturb him. Jim points out that he doesn't really have a clear answer, and starts fiddling with it. And then he sees Steel Palchuk at practice outside of Strickler's office, and Steve then once again makes a ticking noise while wagging his finger. And it's at this point where Strickler then proceeds to realize why Jim is so perturbed. He proceeds to tell him that it's clear he's got a lot of weight on his shoulders, and tells him that he's not really living his life in balance, and then proceeds to tell him exactly what he told him yesterday, that he needs to make time for himself as well as other people, and currently he's not doing a very good job of that, and tells him that as long as he kind of tries to, that obviously he understands that he's taking care of his mother and a bunch of other things, but he also points out he needs to just make time for himself and not over worry about everybody else and what everybody else is doing. And Jim, realizing that Strickler is right, then proceeds to thank him and tells him that he enjoys talking to him and enjoys seeing him, and then proceeds to leave, with Strickler pointing out that he enjoys talking to Jim as well. But then, as Jim is leaving, Strickler sees the amulet in Jim's back pocket of his thing, and in the back pocket of his backpack, and his eyes visibly widen. At which point Jim, later that day, he then proceeds to go home and brings the new thing home, his amulet home, and he still doesn't fully understand what it does, and wonders if it's going to talk to him today, and then proceeds to look at it, and after several minutes of him staring at it in the backyard, the text on the amulet around the ring then proceeds to visibly change, and then proceeds to show a phrase: "For the glory of Merlin, daylight is mine to command." At which point Jim reads it out loud, and suddenly he is engulfed in a blue light, and he is visibly picked up by the blue light, and then a massive armor then proceeds to form around him, which then proceeds to readjust to Jim's size, and then once again a massive sword then proceeds to appear from Jim's right hand, which again adjusts to Jim's size and strength so that he can properly wield it. Jim, pointing out that this is obvious, that this is the coolest thing he's ever saw, then immediately starts playing with his new armor and sword, and starts swinging it around, and he then promptly gets it stuck in a rock, and when he tries to get it out, he then gets it stuck in another rock, which he then tries to pull out of that, and meanwhile, Strickler, he then proceeds to pull over to the ravine in his car. And we do find out that Strickler is actually, well, this is what we find out, but Strickler, he then proceeds to go down into the ravine. He proceeds to go straight to the rock pile that was Kanjigar's body, and then realizing that the amulet is gone, and realizing somebody took it, he then proceeds to reveal that he's actually the bad guy, and that actually, and he is working with Bilar, and when Bilar shows up, he tells Bilar that he failed in retrieving the amulet. But Bilar merely reassures him, pointing out that wherever the champion may be, he will hunt them down, find them, and destroy them, so that he can take the amulet from them. And of course Strickler then proceeds to reassure him, revealing that he's actually a troll himself somehow. But and we'll explain that later. They explain that later, but. His eyes then proceed to glow yellow, and he then proceeds to tell Bilar that he doesn't have to worry all that much and work himself so hard this time, because he points out that the amulet has already chosen its champion, and it's at this point where we see Jim triumphantly pull the sword from the rock, and that's where the first episode ends. So yeah, this series, as I said, the series is amazing, and obviously my review of it was very in depth and complex because I've seen this twice now, but. Yeah, it's a very in-depth, very complex series, and I hope you guys will actually like and enjoy it, because I like and enjoy it. I'm happy to review it for you guys, and I just figured, since it's fresh in my head, and I was like, and I've been meaning to rewatch it for the longest time. I was like, you know what? I'll go back and rewatch it for a review series. I'll do that. I'll just rewatch Tales of Arcadia for you guys, and that'll be a fun time. But Yeah, in any case, this is where the first episode begins, and this is where the series begins, and this is where Jim discovers the Amulet of Daylight. It's where he discovers what it can do, and it establishes him as our main protagonist for the franchise going forward. But in any case, that's going to do it for my review of Tales of Arcadia, the Trollhunters specifically. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Patreon in the description below as well. It's only a couple bucks a month. It does really help me out. And you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks that are my way of saying thanks. So be sure to check those out. Links down in the description. And also, be sure to go and check out my Twitch. I stream Saturdays and Sundays. Not this Saturday because I got a thing. But I stream Saturdays and Sundays. Please go check those out. Link is, again, down in the description. Please go check that out. I'm trying to push for affiliate, and in order to do that, I need you guys to come and actually watch the streams. So yeah, just all you really need to do, go over there, follow the stream, follow me on my Twitch, and hit the little notification that where you know that when we go live. Just have that on, and you'll see the streams, and you'll come to hang out. I'm currently streaming Metopia and Pokemon Legends Arceus. I'll be streaming Scarlet, either Scarlet or Violet soon. Yeah, you guys will know when that will happen. So just follow me over there, and also be sure and go and check out my Go and check out my page. I've already talked about that, but go and check out the videos linked in the end screen as well. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this video. Whereas the bottom video is the video recommended to you based on what you've already seen from me. I have no idea where it'll send you because I think this is my first DreamWorks thing, and B, my first video on Trollhunters and anything Guillermo del Toro has made. So I have no idea where it's going to send you. That'll be an interesting experiment. Let me know in the comments where it's sent to you. But yeah, in any case, yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. As next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!